When I was about 15 years old, we had retired to our house near Belle Reve when we witnessed a most violent and terrible thunderstorm. It advanced in from behind the mountains of Jura, and the thunder burst at once with frightful loudness from the various quarters of the heavens. I remained while the storm lasted, watching its progress with curiosity and delight. As I stood at the door on a sudden, I beheld a stream of fire issue from an old and beautiful oak, which stood about 20 yards from our house, and so soon as the dazzling light vanished, the oak had disappeared, and nothing remained but a blasted stump. When we visited it the next morning, we found the tree shattered in a single manner. It was not splintered by the shock, but entirely reduced to thin ribbons of wood. I never beheld anything so utterly destroyed. So this is how Victor Frankenstein described a storm that he saw when he was a child. And this got him interested. Well, he was already interested in science. This got him a little more interested in science. And this is also where most people say, aha, he used lightning to revive his creation. Now, that being said, the rest of the book goes on. He makes almost no mention of lightning throughout the rest of the book. Or rather, when he does mention lightning, it has nothing to do with the creation of his creature. So, the very next paragraph. Before this, I was not unacquainted with the more obvious laws of electricity. On this occasion, a man of great research in natural philosophy was with us, and excited by this catastrophe, he entered on the explanation of a theory which he had formed on the subject of electricity and galvanism, which was at once new and astounding to me. So, as I said, Frankenstein had been studying science as a child. He was interested in it, and this was his first introduction to the idea of galvanism. Now, galvanism was discovered by Luigi Galvani. He was an Italian scientist. He was a biologist and doctor, and discovered that electricity applied to a frog's leg will cause it to jerk, a dead frog's leg, to be more precise. He discovered this in about 1780. He wrote, where he studied for 11 years and then published a paper on it in 1791. Now, this helps us to date Frankenstein, the book, because all of Mary Shelley's writings on it, she just puts, anytime she puts a date, she puts 17 dash dash. It never gives an exact year. So it happened sometime in the 18th century. We now know that it happened sometimes after galvanism, possibly after Galvani published his book, which would put it in the 1790s, and Frankenstein was 15, or approximately 15, at the point when the book was published, or after the book was published. So he's 15, he grows up, he goes to college, never quite tells how many years he studied in college, and then, he starts to build his creation. So sometime in the late 1790s is when it took place. It's possible that Mary Shelley's intent was to have him create the monster at the turn of the century. We don't know that for sure, but we can at least get an approximate date of when the story is supposed to have taken place. This said, what else do we know about it? So it was 1816 when Mary Shelley actually wrote the book. It was a short story. She published it in 1818 anonymously in London. Then in 1821 she published it again in Paris with her name attached to it. Okay, so like I said, she mentions lightning very little, and that is something. Was the monster brought to life with lightning? It's hard to say. He mentions equipment when he builds it. His mentor when he went to college was Dr. Waldman, who was a chemist. at that time, electricity was pretty much the thing of chemistry. It was basically it was generated by chemical cells. So it was the chemists who were experimenting with it more than the physicists. So it is, but again, they were doing chemical cells. They weren't creating these great flashing, things that look like they come from a physics laboratory that we see in the movies. So it is possible that he skipped over or was not as in depth as the movies would have us believe. He does describe the night in which the creature was created. It was on a dreary night in November, and that's about all he says about it. He doesn't really mention anything about lightning storms or, great thunderstorms or anything to that effect, which usually reflecting a person's mood with the weather is a big literary technique that people like to use, and Mary Shelley ignored it completely. She does mention the rain pattering dismally against the panes, which again doesn't give us the impression of a big thunderstorm or anything like that. It's just that it was a dismal night when he created his creation. We do know that after he created it, he went to his room, collapsed in exhaustion, and partly in horror because it had opened his eyes and it wasn't quite what he was hoping for. Then at some point, a couple hours later, he wakes up. The monster has gone up to his room and is looking at him, and he sees the moonlight reflecting off its eyes. So the rain has cleared away so that the moon can shine through, and so now we have basically, again, more reason to believe this wasn't the great storm that everyone wants to make it out to be. This was just a minor rainfall which gave away to moonlight. He does twice mention the spark of life in the monster, and this would be another electrical reference possibly. The thing is, again, he never follows up on that in any way. I tried to find out if the spark of life, because that's not an unusual phrase to hear. So I tried to find it in literature. Unfortunately, somebody wrote a book called The Spark of Life. So trying to find if there's any reference to the spark of life in literature prior to the writing of Frankenstein, and you get a bunch of references to this book, which was written over 100 years later, called The Spark of Life. And so it's it's possible it was used before Frankenstein. It's possible it was never used before Frankenstein. It's just hard to find on the internet because, again, someone wrote a book called The Spark of Life, and that's going to come up under most of your internet searches. Okay, so yes, wretched devil, you reproach me with your creation. Come on then, that I may extinguish the spark which is I so negligently bestowed. So there we go. That was one of his references that I made a note of. Okay, so before we get too much farther into movies, well, actually, starting with movies. So the first Frankenstein movie was called Frankenstein from Edison Studios. It was made in 1910. It was about 12 minutes long, and it was a silent film. Augustus Phillips played Dr. Frankenstein, and Charles Ogle played the monster. In 1915, there was another film. It was about 70 minutes long. It was called Life Without Soul. It was by Ocean Film Corporation. William Cohill as he played a character called Dr. William Frawley, who was playing the Frankenstein role, and then Percy Standing played someone known as the Brute Man, who was basically the monster. It turns out that this was just a dream that a young man had after reading Frankenstein, the book, at the end. Then there was an Italian film, Il Monstro di Frankenstein, or The Monster of Frankenstein. It's by Albertini Films. It was also made in 1920. It was a silent film. It was cut to about 39 minutes due to censorship that the fascists were doing at the time. Luciano Albertini played Dr. Frankenstein, and Umberto Guarciano played the monster. Then something interesting happened. 1927. Peggy Webling wrote a play called Frankenstein, or An Adventure in the Macabre. And this turns out to be the source for most of the movies at Universal, well, for Universal's main movie when it came out. And so we have a quick or a vast difference between what Mary Shelley wrote and what the movies have. And this is primarily this takes place, or this occurs because it's a stage play trying to write Frankenstein as a stage play and doing changes of scenery and all the other things required for a stage play would have been impossible without changing the script. And so she basically rewrote the story so it will show up on a stage better. And that's what most people see as Frankenstein is based on her play and not on the book. Then 1931, of course, Carl Laemmle makes Frankenstein the Universal Pictures movie. Colin Klein as Frankenstein, Boris Karloff as the monster, or question mark as the monster if you read the credits. But we all know by now that is actually Boris Karloff. He did get film credit in the next movie, Bride of Frankenstein, but up until now he is just question mark. So now we come to the question of how do we vary from the books to the movies? And one thing is, what was Frankenstein's monster made out of? And the answer most people say is, well, dead man's body parts sewn together. And the book really doesn't say that. So Dr. Frankenstein goes on to talk about his studies in chemistry and his interest in life and death. And he starts with, now I was led to examine the cause and progress of this decay and forced to spend days and nights in vaults and charnel houses. My attention was fixed upon every object and most insupportable to the delicacy of the human feeling. I saw how the fine form of man was degraded and wasted. I beheld the corruption of death succeed to the blooming cheek of life. I saw how the worm inherited the wonders of the eye and the brain. And just before this sentence, he had mentioned about noticing how maggots came out of the corpses, basically, is what he's referring to. So he is seeing this as the chemical decay leading to chemical life, and sort of the back and forth. If you remember chemistry, high school chemistry, most of what your reactions when you wrote them out, you were supposed to have a double arrow showing that while this can lead to that, you can also take that and lead it back to this. A lot of chemical processes are reversible, in other words. And so that is sort of what Frankenstein is studying here. He's saying, aha, when something decays, life comes out of it. So studying this combination of interest, this combination of reactions, maybe I can figure out how to create life. Yes. And so finally, after days and nights of incredible labor and fatigue, I succeeded in discovering the cause of generation and life. Nay, more, I become myself capable of bestowing animation upon lifeless matter. Okay, so there he is. He's been able to animate the inanimate. There is one thing wrong with this, though. I might, in process of time, I now renew life where death had apparently devoted the body to corruption. Sounds good, except there's a parenthetical phrase I left out of that. I may in process of time, although I now found it impossible, renew life where death had apparently devoted the body to corruption. So what he's saying here is, I cannot revive something that has once lived. And so now we get back into the question of, was he really taking dead man's parts, sewing them together and animating them? Because he just now said he couldn't do that. I see by your eagerness and the wonder and hope which your eyes express, my friend, that you expect to be informed of the secret which I am acquainted and cannot be. Listen patiently until the end of my story, and you will easily perceive why I am reserved upon the subject. I will not lead you on, unguarded and ardent as I then was, to your destruction and infallible misery. So basically, the book Frankenstein starts with Robert Walden, a sea captain who is on an expedition to go to the North Pole. On his way there, he comes across a craft upon which is Victor Frankenstein. He takes him on board because Frankenstein was deadly ill, very close to death. And when Frankenstein gathers some of his strength back, he starts to tell the captain his story. And did I call him Waldman earlier? I'm sorry, I think his actual name is Walton, I'm not sure. I'll double check that. But, so the story is actually a letter that the sea captain is writing home to his sister about how he found Frankenstein, how Frankenstein told him his story. About midway through Frankenstein's story, the monster tells Frankenstein his story, which he then relays on to the sea captain, which he then relays on to his sister. So we have this big chain of story within story going on here. And so he has just now, told the sea captain, yes, I have discovered the secret of life. No, I'm not going to share it with you because it will only lead to misery. And this is one of the most unsatisfactory parts of Frankenstein, because this big epic thing, creating life from non-life, and we get these little bits and pieces, and nothing even leads up to it well. He just says, I discovered how to make life. Don't ask me how. Okay, what else does he say? Okay, so he's just, once he discovers this, he of course decides to make life. He ambles on for a while, deciding, should I do an animal? What should I do? And finally decides, all or nothing, might as well go for a man. And so he makes the mention here. As the minuteness of the parts formed a great hindrance to my speed, I resolved, contrary to my first intention, to make the being of a gigantic stature, that is to say about 8 feet in height, and proportionably large. So this goes back to, did he make his monster out of dead men's parts? And the answer is, if he did, he would have had to find a bunch of 8-foot tall men in order to get anything to match up with his monster. In short, he started trying to make something the right size. He found out that the size was a hindrance. It was just too hard to make these organs and all properly, so he started making something bigger. Before we get back to his creation, let's look at a few other descriptions of the monster. So at one point, he creates a monster, is disgusted by it, runs off, goes back home. He's basically he's fatigued. He's been doing long nights of study, so he has to heal. Rests up at home, gets his strength back, is taking a walk, and comes across the monster who has followed him. I suddenly beheld the figure of a man at some distance, advancing towards me with superhuman speed. He bounded over the crevices in the ice among which I had walked with caution. His stature also, as he approached, seemed to exceed that of man. So again, he made his creature 8 feet high, and so he sees a 8 foot tall man coming at him. The monster reveals how he met Dr. Frankenstein's brother and killed him. And he's talking about, he said, so he had grabbed his brother, trying to make him his friend. He struggled violently. "Let me go," he cried. "Monster, ugly wretch, you wish to eat me and tear me to pieces. You are an ogre. Let me go, or I will tell my papa." So Frankenstein's brother describes him as an ogre, like, again, a giant, oversized man. So Captain Walton, at the end of the book, Frankenstein dies, and the monster has come on board the boat to actually pay his last respects, as it ends up being. And Captain Walton describes, "Over him hung a form which I cannot find words to describe, gigantic in stature, yet uncouth and distorted in its proportions." So again, this was a larger than normal man, 8 foot tall, probably not made up from the parts of smaller men. It's would have had, so again, the point being, if Frankenstein had sewn together their body parts to make his monster, he would have had to find large men to make him from. "Who shall conceive the horror of my secret toil as I dabbled among the unhallowed damps of the grave, or tortured the living animal to animate the lifeless clay?" So this is an interesting thing here. And I read this and I wonder, when he talks about the lifeless clay here, is he just being symbolic about making it out of clay? Or, like I said, he studied chemistry. Did he mix up some sort of primordial soup type concoction and sculpt his body? And again, this would go back to the question of, he's making it 8 feet tall, so he can't make his own body parts, but he can cut up a dead body, examine its pieces, and put them together, try to sculpt them out of this clay-like material that he made. And again, Shelley doesn't go into enough detail for us to make that assumption one way or the other, but it would explain what she's writing here without him cutting up dead bodies and sewing them back together. "I collected bones from charnel houses and disturbed with profane fingers the tremendous secrets of the human frame." So this is again after he started building his creature. He has started collecting materials from the charnel houses. So this would say, well, so he is making it out of dead body parts, but as I just said with the lifeless clay of the, earlier this paragraph, because these lines are both from the same paragraph, he could have just been taking these body parts to use as a model. Obviously, he studied anatomy. He mentioned studying anatomy earlier, but studying anatomy doesn't mean you can make from memory an organ. So it's possible. I think, in these paragraphs or these phrases, he is talking about collecting body parts to use as a model in order to sculpt his creature. What else do we have here? So at one point, so he's done creating his creature. He gives us no more information. However, the creature later on convinces him to make a mate for him. And so we go into the process of making a mate. We get about the same amount of detail on making her that we got on making the male creature, which, as I said, is not a lot. But among this, we do get some information. So he has decided, after doing this, after promising the creature that he will make it a mate, he makes mention that the philosophers of England, and he's talking about the natural philosophers or the scientists of the day, have information he can use. Um, he already made a creature. Why does he need more information? And the answer to that could be because he made a male creature, now he's making a female. This is again back in the the late 1700s, so anatomy studies haven't been done as much. You know, people have been studying anatomy, but they haven't been studying it as much as they did in the 19th century. It was still sort of taboo to cut into a dead body for you know, some people. So the natural philosophers of England might have been studying women, and so he might get some information on how to put together a woman. He also mentions when he plans to go to England that he sends his chemical equipment ahead, so that he will have it when he starts to make the creature, or the creature's mate, that is. And so we have that going for him. So again, it goes back to this is more a chemical experiment than an electricity experiment, which isn't quite the way to phrase it, because again, electricity was the realm of chemists at this point of time in history. But he leans more towards sending chemicals than sending machinery. So he doesn't seem to be using electricity to animate it. He's using this secret process which he refuses to reveal to us to do so. When he's nearly finished making her, the creature's mate, and the creature appears looking in the window at him because it told him, I will not disturb you, I will watch from a distance, and when you are done, I will come and collect my companion. And so he is in the process, he is close to completing it, he looks up, and out the window he sees the monster looking in at him. As I looked on him, his countenance expressed the utmost extent of malice and treachery. I thought with a sensation of madness on my promise of creating another like to him, and trembling with passion, tore to pieces the thing in which I was engaged. The wretch saw me destroy the creature on whose future existence he depended for happiness, and with a howl of devilish despair and revenge withdrew. So again, this is not, he is not describing something that he is sewing together, and he is describing something that he is sculpting, and then he rips it apart with his hands. And so again, it lends credence to the idea that he actually sculpted his creations and didn't make them from dead body parts, which, again, as he said earlier, he couldn't reanimate something that had been alive before. So the idea that he created the creature came from the play and not from the book, or that he created the creature by sewing together body parts, that is, came more from the play than from the book. If we go into the movies, actually, we see that there were really two parts to them. The creature, he gets the body from a hung man, a man who's been hung. He notices that the hanging had snapped the neck, and so therefore had damaged the brain, so he sends his assistant to get a brain. We all know how that works out. And he puts them together. If you look at Boris Karloff, there aren't a lot of scars on him that indicate body parts sewn together. There are, these scars that you can see in the movie, they're more cosmetic surgery than patchwork stitched together body. And so even the movie lends itself to the idea that he didn't make, while he reanimated something that was already dead, he didn't sew together body parts. It was actually in other later films where they started referring to making a body out of the parts of other men. So let's discuss the movies a little now. So, as I said, the original movie followed the play more than it did the book. Then we come with The Bride of Frankenstein, and we get into some things like a little bit of the monster's history. And primarily, this comes from the scene he goes to the blind man's cottage. He makes friends with the blind man until some other villagers come to visit and notice him and say, this is the monster that's been terrorizing the countryside, and the monster goes away. But he learns to speak a little, the man educates him a little, so we start to get a Frankenstein in The Bride of Frankenstein, which is a little closer to the Frankenstein in the book, eventually, than the first movie. Another interesting thing about The Bride of Frankenstein, well, a couple of interesting. So, Dr. Paracelsus? I forget his... Dr. Pretorius. That's it. Paracelsus is one of the people that Frankenstein studied in the book. He went to college. He was a real man in life, only... basically, he dabbled part in the occult, part in science, and his professor said, "You're wasting your time with this guy," and got Frankenstein interested in studying chemistry rather than this semi-half science. And Frankenstein sort of goes through a few points of he's upset that people are making fun of his old heroes, but as time goes by, he sort of realizes, these guys weren't really giving me anything I can use. They got me interested in science, but didn't really give me any information I can use. So, go to the movie, Dr. Pretorius, and there's the scene with his little people that he created, and he's when he first meets Frankenstein, he says, well, you took a dead body, sewed together dead bodies and gave them life through electricity. I grew my creations. And so he's got these little bell jars with these, 3 or 4 inch tall people in them. And it's just a little comic relief section. But again, it sort of goes back to the book where, in the book, Frankenstein didn't sew his creations together out of dead body parts. He apparently sculpted them. So Dr. Pretorius was a little closer to the book than Dr. Frankenstein was in the movie. Another thing about the movie is, like I said, the monster does gain some intelligence at the end. He gains a little more morality at the end too. Most other references to The Bride of Frankenstein, which don't really exist in movies that often. It's more cartoons like to bring it up, or sitcoms like to bring up the idea of his bride being a more regular occurrence. In most of them, they have the monster being unintelligent and the bride being intelligent, and she does all the talking. And of course, we get to the end of the actual movie, Bride of Frankenstein, and Elsa Lancaster, who plays the bride, just hisses. That's like her only line is hissing. And again, Boris Karloff actually has a few lines and shows a little morality, saying, "Never should have created us. You, Frankenstein, and your wife, you're innocent of all this. We twisted your arm and made you do this. You go, and I'm going to destroy myself and the bride and Dr. Pretorius." And spoiler alert, that's how it ends. Then we go to the Son of Frankenstein, in which Basil Rathbone plays the Son of Frankenstein, and Bela Lugosi plays Igor, who the monster survived the explosion at the end of The Bride of Frankenstein, of course. He is in a weakened state. Igor is his friend. He's sort of befriended him, but he's very weak, so he's going to try to talk Dr. Frankenstein into making the monster stronger. And he actually succeeds, of course. Only there's some back and forth going on between the two of them. He doesn't want to do it. Igor sort of forces him to do it, makes threats. But a few interesting notes about the Son of Frankenstein is that they mentioned that, while yes, in the movies, lightning did bring him to life, the Son of Frankenstein, I can't remember his name exactly, tells them, comes to the discovery, the lightning itself didn't do it. There was a cosmic ray which came down with the lightning, and that's what actually brought the monster to life. And that gave Universal a good reason to say, well, why aren't they just making monsters and having them run around all over the place? Because it was this 1 in a million chance that they got this cosmic ray to animate the monster. And it just coincidence that it came down with the electricity. Electricity will keep them going, but it did not cause the life in the first place. Another thing about it is the Son of Frankenstein is lamenting that the villagers refer to the monster as Frankenstein. And, because these ignorant peasants. And they never do that anywhere else in any of the sequels. And so it's a wonder on my mind was this Universal's way to, let's start calling the monster Frankenstein, and so we're going to introduce this, and then they just never followed up on that? Or do we go the other way and say, we're making fun of people who call the monster Frankenstein? They just got tired of people saying, yeah, the monster is Frankenstein, and so they're trying to point out, no, it's not. If that's the case, then they actually gave us a right to call the monster Frankenstein, because society names things. And if society names things, then the people of Visaria, which is the town where Frankenstein created his creation and all of this takes place, they're the ones who are terrorized by the monster. So if they start calling the monster Frankenstein and society names things, then we're all, justified in calling the monster Frankenstein now, because the people of the peasants of Visaria did so. And even though Frankenstein's son belittled them for it, society names things. So the monster's Frankenstein, feel free to call him that. So we mentioned Visaria, so we go on to the Ghost of Frankenstein, in which yet another son, Ludwig Frankenstein, exists. Interesting thing here, at the end of the Son of Frankenstein, Basil Rathbone decides to go back to America, because that's where he grew up. The monster is dead, or so they think, and so he bequeaths the castle and all the surrounding lands to the citizens of Visaria to use however they want to use it. And then along comes the next movie, Ghost of Frankenstein, where we find that it's called Frankenstein, is the name of the village now. And Visaria is another village somewhere else where Igor eventually takes the monster to, in order to find another son of Frankenstein, this one being named Ludwig. So we have changed the town name in order to use the old town name in another town. What else? Oh yeah, so at the beginning the peasants are upset. Igor, who Basil Rathbone shot at the end of the first movie, somehow survived. The peasants are upset because they still think he's alive, or there have been sightings of him. They're afraid the monster's going to come back. They're like, what are we going to do? There's a big town council meeting. The mayor's like, don't do anything rash, don't do anything drastic. And someone in the audience, or not the audience, but the chambers, one of the peasants yells out something to the effect of, there's going to be an election coming up soon, so you better do something about this monster. And the mayor stops and thinks for a second and says, well, I don't want you to do anything drastic, but do what you want to do. Because, of course, politicians and elections, best way to get them to let you have free reign. So someone yells out, let's blow up the castle. And in the next scene, there are people, a mob carrying torches and boxes of dynamite to Frankenstein Castle to blow it up. Um, like, that's not a disaster waiting to happen, Just takes one person to trip, and then you have a chain reaction of explosions. Doesn't happen in the movie, but at the same time, it's like, it's at that point where I would have said, the rest of the mob can go ahead, I'm going back home, and I'll listen to the explosions from a distance. Igor takes the monster to the Nuvis area, finds Ludwig, Frankenstein, gets separated from the monster. The monster finds a little girl who was a better Wednesday Addams than any of the Wednesday Addams in any of the film or movie. She would have been a better one, except she was born 20 years too early, apparently. The townspeople capture the monster because he's a threat to this little girl, even though she thinks he's a friend. And by a weird series of coincidences, Dr. Ludwig Frankenstein has been he's been studying the mind, he's been curing the insane, etc., etc. So someone goes to him and says, we've got an insane man, can you come? We're having a hearing to find out, competency, etc., etc. Can you come and see him? Just before he leaves, Igor stops by and talks to him and says, they've captured the monster that your father made, and if you don't help me, then I am going to let everyone know that you are the son of Frankenstein. You aren't some distant relative, or you aren't some other from another Frankenstein family, and people are going to hate you for it. So we have this big, coincidental, three or four coincidences, all leading Dr. Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein Jr., I guess it would be, to the courtroom to see the monster. Series of incidents. The Ghost of Frankenstein, as the movie is called, not played by Clive Collins, comes and sees his son. So Ludwig's plan is, I have to get rid of this monster. It's indestructible apparently, but it was put together by sewing together dead men's parts, in the movies at least. I will just dissect it, and that's the way to destroy the monster, which is a good plan. Igor, of course, makes more threats, and then, he's getting ready to do this, actually, and the ghost of his father comes, again, not played by Clive Collins this time around, and says, the only problem with the monster is that it's got a bad brain. It killed your friend, because that happened also in this film. Your friend was a good man. If you put your friend's brain in the monster, then my creation still lives, and your friend lives on, and you'll be famous. And so he's going to, Frankenstein's going to do that. Him and one of his other doctor friends are doing it. Igor says, look, you've lived in Frankenstein's shadow all along. If you put my brain in the monster, then I'll be your friend. I will be, powerful and strong, and you will get all the recognition you deserve as a doctor. So that's the big plan. They put Igor's plane in the monster. Things go horribly wrong. Spoiler alert, of course. There's the big scene of Igor stumbling around in the monster's body, knocking over shelves of chemicals and then bursting into flame instantly. There are some chemicals which contact with air will cause them to burst into flame. Having shelves and shelves of these in one lab, it just seems like a dangerous thing to do. There have, of course, been following the Ghost of Frankenstein comes Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, which brings back Lon Chaney as the Wolfman for his second showing. And from this point on, the movies pretty much go into monster mashups. And so the next movie, we have the Wolfman and Dracula meet Frankenstein. And the movie after that, the three of them get together again. And it goes on and on that way. There have, of course, been other movies about Frankenstein. Um, Probably too many to name. Some of them, they're good attempts at modernizing the story. Others are not. Young Frankenstein, we can't ignore. Young Frankenstein was based more on the son of Frankenstein than on Frankenstein. There are a couple scenes of them getting the body was a satire of a scene from Frankenstein, and of course there's the part where Frankenstein meets the monster meets the blind man, which is a take from The Bride of Frankenstein. Great movie. They also took a lot of the mechanical effects, the electrical equipment and all that from the original movie, and used that again in Young Frankenstein. So, yeah, Mel Brooks probably made the best sequel to Frankenstein outside of the original Universal films. And so that is all I have to say about Frankenstein. I hope you enjoyed, and I will talk to you later.